Hello, everyone, and thank you, David. We're really honored and really excited to be working with David and the University of Alberta, co-sponsoring this speaker program, the Low Carbon Transition Program. And I really want to welcome you here tonight. I'm really excited to see so many people out, and it's just great to have this for our first event. I think we're all going to have a very informative and inspiring evening. I've been up since 6 a.m. in back-to-back meetings with Tim Flannery, and I can tell you that I don't think one person has left who hasn't walked away with more information and taking a piece of the optimism that Tim has about the energy transition that we're going through. So I just want to give you a minute about Clean Energy Canada, Tides Canada. Tides Canada is Canada's largest national public foundation that focuses on environmental and social justice issues. About 5% of our portfolio goes to energy issues. You'll be happy to know most of that is from Canadian donors. And I'm happy to say that most of that goes to our team's initiative, Clean Energy Canada, to do this kind of work. So what is this kind of work? Clean Energy Canada, we're working to accelerate Canada's transition to a low-carbon economy. And by that, what we do is we are working on solutions. We're working on bringing together businesses and civil society groups to drive forward policy change and to drive forward voluntary actions. We're not against fossil fuels. We're not against the energy sector. In fact, we're really working to ensure that Canada's energy sector is a leader through the global shift to clean and renewable energy. We know change is coming, and our interest is that Canada not just survives through that change, but that Canada actually thrives through that energy transition and change. I have a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. First, I want to thank Bullfrog Power for powering tonight's event with green energy. I think somebody's here from Bullfrog, so please take our thanks back to Bullfrog tomorrow. And programs. Programs are key to being a winner tonight, so hold on to your program. And speaking of the program, what we'll be doing tonight is really, as David said, we'll be having a discussion. Our guests will be having a conversation up here, and then we're going to invite you to join that discussion. There's mics here for you to come and ask questions. We'll also be using Twitter, for those of you who are more tech-savvy than I. The hashtag is #LowCarbon, and so you can tweet in your questions, and they'll get relayed up here as well. My fourth housekeeping item, oh yes, we are a charitable non-profit organization, and if you're inspired by what we're doing here and what you see tonight, feel free to make a donation at cleanenergycanada.org. And so, I now have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our guests. First, Dr. Robert Page. I think many of you might know Bob. I was always excited when I showed up in some city across the country to have a conversation about energy and energy transition, and there was Bob with his cheerful smile and always his enthusiasm and positive attitude. Bob's the director of the Enbridge Centre for Corporate Sustainability at the University of Calgary. He was formerly the Vice President of Sustainable Development at TransAlta. He's on the board of ENMAX. He was formerly the chair of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, and is really one of Canada's leading thinkers on the transition to a low-carbon economy and the opportunities that are there for all of us. Our second speaker is Dr. Tim Flannery. Tim is the he's the Chief Commissioner of the Australian Climate Commission. He'll be telling us more about that tonight. He's the author of 130 scientifically peer-reviewed papers. He's credited with discovering more species than Darwin. He's got a host of books, including The Future Eaters and the New York Times best-selling book, The Weather Makers, that many of you may have read and was really a seminal piece of work on climate change. And so with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Tim and Bob and invite them up here to the stage.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. This is a tremendously encouraging thing to see the number of people interested in what we're trying to talk about tonight. I'm so delighted we have Tim with us tonight. And I'd just like to start off tonight by turning the mic over to Tim for just some interesting observations other than his airline flight.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you. It's funny, you know, whenever I come to Canada, I feel like I'm visiting an identical twin brother that was separated at birth somehow. You know, it's like there are so many similarities between the two countries. We're both, in terms of our democracies, broadly similar. Our economies are similar with the resource base and the importance of natural resources. Obviously, common cultural heritage and all the rest of it. And yet there are some fundamental differences, some things that have changed since 200 years ago when we were set up. But it's always, for me, enormously stimulating to come here because it is the same but a little bit different, you know, and that makes you think about a lot of your assumptions. So maybe I'll just start with that observation.
Well, I would like to pick up on it because when I was at TransAlta, we had power plants for the Western Mining Corporation in Western Australia. All I had to do was substitute the word Ottawa for Canberra, state for province, federal for Commonwealth, and it was all the same rhetoric whatsoever. So the one difference, of course, was the accent, right, which our power plants were out in the backcountry, so that we had some interesting discussions. And the other thing that Australia has that Canada and Alberta can't compete with is all those snakes and scorpions. Ours are all in the House of Commons, not out on the back. So anyway, on that rather light note, I just wanted to sneak in a more, I think, a more interesting question, and that is, when we begin to look at the environment and energy, the systems that they have to operate in become so important. And do you see differences in the systems between Australia and Canada? I know you know it well. And I just wanted to sort of lead into some of the other questions by just looking at sort of an overview on systems questions, which I think at least are important.
Sure, no, they really are. I mean, we both have enormous countries, you know, and Australia at least has a very extensive electricity grid which runs through the southeast of the country. It's probably one of the largest well-integrated grids on the planet. Yeah, I guess your stuff runs along the border with the US and is well connected southwards, but maybe not so much east-west, would be my guess.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So there are differences there, but it's the natural endowments of the countries that are so different. I mean, you have hydro, so much hydro, which has been a huge benefit. I think it may also be something of a, well, we'll see. It may be something of a, not a problem, but a brake on things in the future. In Australia, we've had lots of cheap coal. You know, until a decade ago, over 90% of our electricity was generated through burning coal. And yet we have some of the finest wind resources and finest solar resources on the planet as well. Right. That's changed in the last decade, but yeah, so you're quite right. Those natural endowments, the nature of the energy system and the requirements are different. I think
your federal government has done a little better job of it than ours necessarily on some of these issues. Is that a fair comment?
Probably not. I think, well, I shouldn't really say that. We have done some good things, but everything, you know, wherever I travel in the world, everyone has a rosy view of what's happening overseas. They don't see the hard grind it takes to get anything done, you know. They just see the sort of outcome, and so things look easy or better. But you know, we have had a very divided view of what needs to be done in Australia. The one big difference for us is that I think federally energy policy is important, whereas here it's much more a state or province-based.
That's right.
Yeah, so it is possible to get the nation moving in one direction in Australia, you know, more easily. But we've had deep divisions over climate change and energy policy that with each election, you know, things change. And that has been a disaster for business because you know, policy certainty when you're making infrastructure decisions that pay off over years and decades is so essential. You've got to have that. I think, you know, it just helps business so much to know that the policy settings aren't going to change abruptly into the future.
One of the things that's so critical right now, and we really feel this here in Alberta, is how our whole economy transforms from a carbon-based economy to a post-carbon economy in connection with it. Now, you've already mentioned the coal in Australia, which, but how do we do this kind of transition? Because this is so central to both our countries' economies, so central to university financing, so central to government financing and everything else, so central to jobs, that there's a complexity here that is almost intimidating in terms of looking at it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And on top of that, we are really learning on the job because we haven't known which policy instruments work best under certain circumstances until recently. And you're quite right. I mean, this is such a complex area of economic, environmental, social interactions that it has been very difficult to make progress initially. But I think that, you know, over the last 5 years, things have really started to change. You know, following the Copenhagen meeting, we had the Copenhagen Accord signed, which committed various nations to reduction targets. The US and Canada both have the same target, you know, minus 70%. And the US is well on the way to achieving that. So emissions peaked in 2008 in the US and they've been going down, they're down 8% since. Australia had a minus 5% target below 2000 levels. And we are making progress too on that. We've had a big change just 3 years ago in the Australian context. We had a new government elected that brought in a clean energy bill, which was very comprehensive in the sort of measures it brought forward. It brought in a carbon price. It established a clean energy finance corporation. It established a research and development fund and a whole series of important initiatives. They're really paying off for us now. And I might just spend a minute, if I could, just talking about this transition and the impact they've had. Over the last 12 months in Australia, we've seen emissions from the electricity sector drop by nearly 10%. And that's happened because we've shifted away from coal. The carbon price has caused black coal particularly to be less competitive. But at the same time, renewable energy sources are becoming so much cheaper. We've seen a drop in the production costs for solar panels of 80%. And now in Australia, solar is a booming industry. It's still only a small percentage of generation, but it is fundamentally changing the electricity market, as is wind. And when I look at that, you know, how do you make that transition? How does it happen? I always think about Germany, because Germany has had a very long-standing policy of fostering and encouraging renewable energy. They now have 70 gigawatts of renewable energy, going up 10% this year to 77 gigawatts. You know, on a sunny Sunday in Germany, renewables run the country, you know, big impacts. But, and because they're bidding in at zero fuel cost prices, these renewables, they are in a sense the new baseload in places like Germany. It's a funny sort of baseload electricity because it's got a wavy top on it, you know, and the amount goes up and down. And initially we all thought this was a disadvantage, you know, there was a concern about it. But two things have become evident recently. One is that you can run a perfectly reliable grid, as Germany does, with very large volumes of renewables, and that's Germany has one of the most reliable grids in the European network area. And the second is that those kind of wavy peaks actually are beneficial because you're getting a lot, in the case of Europe, a lot of overnight wind, for example. So you're getting electricity generated when no one really can use it at the moment. And people are turning their mind to how you actually use that, how you harness that, store that energy or turn it to other purposes. Some of the innovative things I've seen in Europe involve, for example, taking that electricity to make natural gas that you can feed straight into the pipeline. You know, just with hydrolysis of water and CO2 combined, you get natural gas. Other companies are looking at how you make long-chain hydrocarbons from CO2 and water with electricity. So there's some really innovative stuff that's taking that cheap energy and pushing the transition further. But could cut me off if I'm talking too long here, but it's the area I'm really interested in now. What I see with all of these innovations is that the bandwidth, if you want, for the fossil fuel industry in terms of price is narrowing over time. So if you think back 30 years, you know, the oil price could bounce around a lot because the cost of oil recovery was low and there wasn't much competition from renewables. So even if the price rose to $140, it was still, wouldn't foster clean energy or much in terms of efficiency. If it dropped very low, it didn't matter because the cost of recovery was small. But today, the cost of recovery has gone way, way up. We're chasing difficult oil now, And even fossil fuel resources like gas, which were basically free 30 years ago, was a waste product from the Middle East and stuff, now is climbing in price. At the same time, clean energy technologies are starting to compete at the upper price margin for these fossil fuels. So, the fluctuations that you can have in terms of fuel price can have a big impact. And we've lived through this in Australia just in the last 12 months, where we were the world's largest exporter of coal. And thermal coal for us was a bit like oil for you guys from the oil sands, But the price has dropped so low now that it's not worth digging the stuff up. And we've had massive retrenchments in the labour force in coal in Australia, 20% drop. We're looking how do we adjust to that. But renewables are absolutely booming.
Well, renewables are certainly making steady progress here in Canada, but one of the real difficulties we've run into is the price of natural gas is so low that it sort of that increase has tapered off, and we're seeing many more conversions to natural gas-fired plants as opposed. And one of the things that really strikes me is that for the future of renewables, the world price of oil and the local price of natural gas are just critical to making the economics right for renewables really to begin to take off.
That's right. Well, in Australia, we went through a period of building a lot of natural gas-fired power plants. Most of those are now sitting idle because the price of gas is higher than it is here, and the price of renewables just keeps on coming down, and there's no space in the market for gas. In Europe, the gas generation is finished at the moment. In places like Germany, they built a lot of stock for the same reasons, and they're just not running. They're selling them off after just testing them and sending them overseas. But the bottom line for this sort of stuff is utility values. There's been a write-down in the value of the European utilities of $500 billion in the last 5 years. And that's because of overinvestment in gas, this unanticipated shift to renewables, further penetration of solar, and dropping demand, because the solar, you don't need to buy into the market. So things are changing really, really quickly, and it's extremely challenging for economies when you've got such write-offs like that.
I was really interested in your comments about the new government bringing in this bill and bringing in a price. That's a price for carbon, is it?
That's right. It was $23 a tonne initially.
Because initially we had a kind of supplementary price here in Alberta, $15 a tonne. There have been discussions between Ottawa and Alberta with regard to expanding that as part of the equivalency arrangement between the two levels of government. But that's never happened yet. And yet at the same time, we've got companies like Shell with a shadow price of $40 a tonne behind the scenes in their own corporate planning, which is interesting because they're assuming that that price is probably going to be, when you look at a 40-year life of a refinery or something like that, then that is going to be a background assumption that they need to feed into the system. Are you seeing prices beyond that initial price in Australia?
Sure. I think that's prudent practice to figure in a shadow price at that level. We are seeing carbon trading expand around the world. Azerbaijan just introduced carbon trading. It's the 40th jurisdiction to do so. And of course, your Californian scheme, or just south here, has started this year. So carbon pricing is definitely gaining widespread favour around the world. Prices generally are below that you've talked about there. But they're only generally, I think, going to go in one direction. But Bob, I wonder, is that the key issue? When I talk to my friends in the oil and gas sector, they say their nightmare was always either the price of oil would go so high that people couldn't afford it and they'd switch to substitute fuels, or to drop so low they couldn't afford to recover it out of the ground. And if you look at demand for oil at the moment is being held up by China. I spent 2 months in China recently, and you see the problems, the air pollution problems, the road congestion problems. Something has to give in China, and it was China that really destroyed the coal market in Australia by cutting coal use by 5%. That announcement was just a month ago now, but done some other things before that. But to cut coal use burning in China by 5% over 4 years is huge. And how much do they have to cut back on oil imports before you drop the price down below the floor? And that's the big question, I think. And these are disruptive changes that occur. And they've actually happened in the case of my country. We're living in the aftermath of it now. But I think for Albertans, thinking about this, how do you develop a sustainable economy, sustainable approach to resource extraction? We have to recognise that we're living in this world which it's going through very profound change in energy markets.
Well, it's interesting you raised the issue of China, because that is very much in the background of a great deal of thinking here in Alberta. In terms of capital resources from China, and of course China is, in the last 2 years, probably the largest foreign investor in Alberta. Challenged by Malaysia the other day, which was an interesting one for LNG, competing with Australia, I might add, in connection with that. But the issue that I see in connection with this is that these world prices become so critical. And once again, it comes back to what I tried to start off with, which is a kind of systems approach. So changes in natural gas pricing then impact renewables, impact oil, impact coal, impact everything. And our great challenge today in looking forward to the future is trying to get some kind of sense of how that interaction and what those prices may be. Because if the history of many of these resources is a very unstable one in terms of doing it, I often think back to a story that I heard a long time ago of Louis Armstrong when he was at the prime of his career, and a young reporter came up to him and said, "Well, Mr. Armstrong, where will jazz be 25 years from now?" And Louis snarled back, "If I knew, don't you think I'd be there?" And I think that's what we're all trying to do is look at these variables, understand them to the degree that it's possible to model them, but at the same time feeling a profound sense of uncertainty how all of them will interact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess for me, the key drivers I see globally, China's the most important of them. And there is no doubt that China has now decided they've had it with importing coal, and they're moving very firmly towards clean energy sources. This year, investment in wind and solar in China is about $53 billion US. That buys them enough infrastructure to power the whole Australian economy, in 1 year. So they are moving very fast. And it's not just what happens internally for them that's important, it's the external ramifications. So the price of production for solar panels, I think I mentioned, has dropped 80% in 4 years, and will continue to drop. It's now people are looking at inverter technology and the price is dropping there. So it's just becoming more and more cost competitive with mainstream electricity. Wind is going through the same revolution. We've seen in the European market, the wind energy sector used to be a bit bespoke. The small companies making these different varieties. That's all changing. They're now going into mass production with containerized. Everything's containerized, even the towers. And it's going to be, the prices will halve in the next 5 years. The cost of production for wind infrastructure is likely to halve in the next 5 years.
Well, we run into exactly the same, because China has in fact dumped solar panels here in North America. I don't know, and the costs of them have turned out to be very low indeed in comparison to earlier years. The one thing that's interesting here is the interplay now in North America between solar and wind. A year and a half ago, wind was probably the dominant player in terms of looking forward, but these changes in prices now, there are a whole group of Calgary companies, for instance, today looking at solar in a way that they didn't before. But this raises a whole interesting situation as well, because what we're really trying to look at is the way in which we can trigger and promote innovation, technology innovation. Because if we're going to get to a post-carbon era, then the speed and the efficiency at which we can move to those new technologies is very much at the front and center in terms of where we're going. So do you see solar in a beautiful sunny country like Australia, where the Calgary likes to brag about how much sunshine it gets? When I've been in Australia, we pale in comparison to Australia in connection with this. So do you see solar then really beginning to take off now?
I think that is the technology of the future, particularly for countries like Australia. I mean, not only do we have lots of sunlight, but we're sort of rugged individualists as well, and you know, the idea of having your own
I never
power
could have
supply.
guessed.
Exactly, and sort of saying to the energy company, well, sorry guys, I'm doing my own thing here, you know, it's very tempting to many Australians. And we've led in, Australia has led in terms of technological innovation in the solar panel area.
Right.
We're now playing a strong role in the battery storage area as well.
Right.
And, you know, we are on the cusp now of seeing batteries for households, which will just be wheeling things you'll buy down at the local hardware, you know. And that'll give you initially probably a couple of hours of storage, but that is so important in the energy market because you're just going through that peak, the evening peak then, and taking that. And, you know, those utilities that have lost $500 billion of value in Europe, you wonder what the role for large utilities is in these, you know, as this transition deepens. So yeah, solar for my bet, and particularly for countries like India, you know, it's just, once the prices come down, it has to be the way forward. I think there's still going to be an important role for wind as well because their cost of production is coming down. But you know, when you get to the fuel sources where you have a cost for fuel, the fossil fuels and those sort of things, I think the future is less certain. This gas issue in the US, I think the critical issue there is how long a price is going to remain low. And that, I think, is anyone's guess.
One of the challenges I faced when I chaired the National Roundtable was trying to convey to politicians and convey to the public complex science like climate change in a manner in which it could be absorbed quickly and understood in connection with it. I had some peripheral involvement with the Intergovernmental Panel, which tried to do it by taking the tough, hard science volumes that we all have up on our shelves and paid far too much to Cambridge University Press for them. And then they tried to do these summaries for decision makers, I think they called it. And yet if I can use this term without being totally critical here, the disruptions between, or the trivialization between the complexity of what we're trying to do with climate change and the way in which it was then being translated into policy led to some of the misunderstandings that emerged from this. And so in looking at this, whether it's climate change, whether it's oil and gas technology, whether or not it's some of the new renewables, we have this enormous challenge of trying to take complexity and make it meaningful for the average voter and even for the average politician.
That's absolutely right, and that's what I've been, I guess that's been my principal role for the last 3 years as Chief Climate Commissioner, is just trying to provide information to the Australian public in ways they can readily understand. And we've developed a particular way of doing that, which I think has been pretty effective. You know, there's 6 commissioners, there were 6 commissioners, now 5 councillors, so 5 of the 6 continued on. But, you know, we've tried to be very focused on the evidence. So we're not a lobby group, we're not anything else, we just provide evidence. And among the councillors, we have an ex-CEO of a fossil fuel company in Australia. We've got some very good scientists, we've got an engineer who works with the steel sector. So we just bring the evidence to the people, and our skill is to try to explain things simply. And what we do is we travel around the country. We go out and have town hall meetings very much like this, where we have a discussion like this maybe, or present a 15-minute presentation, and then answer people's questions. You know, we'll have a business breakfast the next morning and engage business people, and then we might go to a university or whatever, and use the media. So, you know, get to the local newspapers, make sure you're on the radio, make sure that you're being tweeted, and, you know, get your key graphics for your reports are getting out there. And of course, with every one of those engagements, we have a report, we have a focus of interest. It might be what's happening internationally. It might be what was the summer about? Why was it so hot? You know, what was the recent flood? How much did climate change influence that? So it's really important that you keep topical, you keep the focus on that, but I think remain independent and just focused on the evidence. And I've noticed over the 3 years just how much public understanding has shifted. People really understand a lot of this now. It's just that repetition, that engagement.